Lieutenant Marcus Rivera was trying very hard not to die during his third day of joint combat training with the Savari, and he was beginning to think that his selection for this program had been less diplomatic honor and more comedic sacrifice to interspecies relations. The Savari were everything humanity aspired to be militarily: disciplined, precise, lethally effective, with martial traditions that predated human spaceflight by several millennia. Getting 10 human officers into their elite training program had been a coup for the Terran Alliance, proof that humanity was being taken seriously as a potential military partner, rather than dismissed as the galactic newcomers who'd barely figured out FTL 40 years ago. Marcus had been thrilled when he was selected. PhD in xenosociology, 8 years of military service, combat experience in 3 campaigns, linguistic aptitude that made him one of the few humans who could actually pronounce Savari phonemes correctly. He'd been perfect for the program, right up until the actual training started, and he discovered that Savari combat doctrine was based on movement patterns, spatial reasoning, and sensory processing that his human brain was simply not equipped to handle naturally. Left flank anchor, rotating advance. Instructor Caleth's voice carried across the training facility, and Marcus tried to process what that meant in terms of actual positioning, while also tracking the other 7 warriors in his unit, who were already moving before the words finished leaving her mouth. He ended up in the wrong position. Again, slightly behind and offset from where he should have been, breaking the formation's integrity, forcing the warrior to his right to adjust to compensate. Caleth's ears flattened against her head. Irritation. Marcus had learned to recognize that one at least, and she called a halt to the drill. The Savari were elegant in ways that made humans look clumsy. Tall and lean, their bodies covered in natural armor plating that seemed to flow with their movements rather than restricting them. Their ears were long and mobile, swiveling independently to track sounds that Marcus's human ears couldn't even detect. Their eyes were amber, luminous, capable of seeing in spectrums humans needed technological assistance to access. Instructor Caleth was all of that plus a combat record that included actions Marcus could only read about in classified briefings that made his palms sweat. She approached him now with the kind of controlled patience that suggested she was reassessing whether humans were worth the diplomatic effort. "Lieutenant Rivera," she said, and her voice carried harmonics that his translator rendered as mild disappointment, which was somehow worse than anger. "You're 3 seconds behind every formation shift. You're watching the other warriors, following their movements, but you're always reacting rather than anticipating. Why?" "I don't know, instructor," Marcus admitted, because lying to a Savari who could probably hear his heartbeat would be stupid. "I'm trying to process the verbal commands and translate them into positioning, but by the time I've figured out where I should be, everyone else is already there. I'm missing something. I know I am, but I can't identify what." Caleth's ears tilted in a position Marcus's cultural database weakly labeled as contemplative assessment. "You're following auditory cues," she said, not quite making it a question. "Yes, instructor. Your commands tell us what formation to execute, and I'm trying to translate that into." "That's your problem." Caleth gestured at the other warriors. "We don't primarily rely on auditory cues for formation coordination. By the time I voice a command, competent warriors have already read the signal and begun executing. You're waiting for translation when the information is already present." Marcus blinked. "Instructor, I'm not sure I understand." "What signal?" "The status plates." Caleth turned, presenting her back, and Marcus tried very hard not to notice that her armor plating along her spine and hips had patterns etched into it that were glowing softly with colors that shifted as she moved. "We evolved as visual coordinators. Our armor plates display tactical status, combat readiness, intended movements, formation roles. We read each other constantly, processing information faster than speech could convey it." She turned back to face him. You're trying to learn our combat doctrine through linguistic instruction, but our combat doctrine is primarily visual kinesthetic. That's why you're always behind. You're accessing secondary communication when you should be reading primary. Marcus processed this, his xenosociology background suddenly feeling inadequate. Instructor, with respect, humans don't have armor plates. We can't display the same information. How am I supposed to read signals my species doesn't produce? You're not supposed to produce them, Lieutenant. You're supposed to read them from us. That's how interspecies combat coordination works. Each species contributes their strengths, learns to interpret their partner's communication styles. Calith's ears tilted forward, challenge, Marcus thought, or maybe expectation. But you're right that it's difficult. Most allied species require months of training with translation implants before they can even begin to process our status plate language. It's one reason we don't often coordinate with other forces. Great, so Marcus was supposed to master in weeks what other species needed months and technological assistance to achieve. This was going excellently. Understood, instructor. I'll work on visual processing exercises. See that you do. Dismissed for now. We'll resume formation training tomorrow. The other warriors dispersed, and Marcus headed to the facility's observation area where he could review recordings of the training session and try to figure out what the hell he was supposed to be looking at. He pulled up the footage, watching Calith's movements frame by frame, and finally zoomed in on the armor plating she'd mentioned. The patterns were definitely doing something. Colors shifting from amber to blue to green, patterns contracting and expanding, certain sections glowing brighter at specific moments. It was like watching a language he didn't speak, information-dense but incomprehensible. Marcus spent 3 hours analyzing the patterns, cross-referencing them with the formation commands, trying to identify correlations. Calith had said left flank anchor, rotating advance, right after her lower back plates had shifted from amber to blue and the hip plates had contracted their pattern inward. Did that color shift mean defensive positioning? Did the pattern contraction indicate anchoring rather than mobile rolls? He didn't know, but he was going to figure it out because the alternative was washing out of the program and proving that humans couldn't adapt to Savari combat doctrine, which would damage the alliance relationship and make Marcus personally responsible for diplomatic setback. No pressure. The next day's training started with individual drills, basic movements and positions that didn't require formation coordination. Marcus tried to focus on the fundamentals while also watching Calith's armor plating, attempting to correlate her status plates with her movements. When she dropped into a defensive crouch, her lower back plates shifted to deep blue. When she executed an offensive strike, they flared green. When she held a ready position, they maintained steady amber. Colors meant something. He just had to decode what. The problem was that he kept finding his gaze drawn to her lower back and hip plating, because that's where the most visible pattern changes occurred, which meant he was spending a lot of time staring at his instructor's posterior region while trying to learn tactical communication. This was going to look so bad if anyone asked what he was doing. Formation drills, Calith announced, and Marcus snapped his attention back to the broader training group. 8 warriors plus him, executing coordinated maneuvers that required them to shift roles and positions fluidly. Marcus watched Calith's status plates. Right before she called the first formation shift, her plates changed, blue to amber pattern expanding outward. Was that the signal? Did expanding patterns mean mobile positions? He moved based on the visual cue instead of waiting for the verbal command, and he was in the right position. Holy shit, it had worked. The next formation shift showed the same pattern, plates changing before the verbal command, Marcus reading the visual signal and moving with the other warriors instead of after them. He was still slower than the Savari, his human reflexes not quite matching their speed, but he was anticipating rather than reacting. That was progress. 3 more formations executed successfully, and Marcus felt something like triumph building in his chest. He was figuring it out. He was actually starting to decode the status plate language without translation assistance or formal training in what the signals meant. Then Caliph stopped mid-movement and turned to face him with an expression he couldn't read, and Marcus's triumph evaporated into sudden anxiety because she'd clearly noticed something and he had no idea if it was good or bad. Her ears were positioned in a configuration his database had no reference for, forward but tilted, twitching slightly. Surprise, confusion, anger. "Lieutenant Rivera," she said, her voice carrying harmonics his translator struggled with. "Why do you keep looking at my butt?" Marcus's brain went through several stages of processing in rapid succession. First, "Oh God, she noticed I've been staring." Second, "This looks terrible. This looks so terrible. I'm going to get expelled for harassment." Third, "How do I explain tactical observation without sounding like I'm making excuses?" Fourth, "Why is she smiling?" Wait, she was smiling. Savari smiles involved more teeth than human smiles and looked vaguely threatening until you learned the context. But that was definitely amusement. "Instructor, I apologize. I was trying to, I wasn't," Marcus stammered, his face heating in what was probably very visible mortification, given that humans broadcast embarrassment through facial flushing in ways that most aliens found fascinating. Then Caliph started laughing. Not polite amusement, not mocking condescension. Genuine, surprised laughter that carried harmonics. Marcus's translator rendered as delighted discovery and unexpected joy. "You're reading the status plates," Caliph said, and now her voice had shifted from potentially offended to something like wonder. "By the ancestors, you're actually reading them, without training, without translation protocols, just reading them." Marcus blinked, his mortification transforming into confusion. Yes. I was trying to. The colors change before you call formations, and I thought maybe they were indicating what shift was coming, so I was watching to see if I could predict." He stopped because Caliph was staring at him, with an intensity that suggested this was important in ways he didn't understand. "Instructor, did I do something wrong?" "Wrong? No. Unprecedented, yes. Wrong, no." Caliph moved closer, and Marcus resisted the instinct to step back because backing away from a Savari warrior during training was interpreted as defensive positioning that would trigger automatic counter-response conditioning. "Human Marcus, do you understand what you just said? You've been here 3 days. 3 days, and you're unconsciously processing our combat language. Most allied species take months of dedicated training to even recognize that the status plates carry information, let alone decode it." "I don't think I'm decoding it properly, instructor. I'm just noticing patterns. The colors shift before you move, and certain colors seem to correlate with certain actions, so I was trying to use that to anticipate." "Your pattern matching," Caliph interrupted, her ears now fully forward. Maximum interest. Marcus was learning to recognize these. "That's how we learn it naturally as children. We pattern match until the correlations become intuitive. You're doing in days what takes our warriors years of training." Marcus was pretty sure he wasn't doing anything that impressive, but Caliph's expression suggested she thought otherwise. Around them, the other warriors in the training group had stopped their exercises and were watching the exchange with varying expressions that Marcus couldn't fully parse. "Instructor Caliph," one of them said, a male warrior whose name Marcus had learned was Drevin. "Are you suggesting the human is learning status plate language without formal instruction? That's not possible for non-Savari species." "I'm suggesting that this human is demonstrating exactly that capability," Caliph replied without taking her eyes off Marcus. "Lieutenant, I need you to test something for me. When I executed the last 3 formations, what did my status plates display before each transition?" Marcus's memory for visual details was pretty good, part of why he'd been successful in xenosociology, so he called up the recent sequence. "First transition, your lower back plates shifted from amber to deep blue, and the hip plates contracted their pattern inward." Second transition, green flare starting at your spine and expanding outward, hip plates expanded pattern simultaneously. Third transition, rapid cycling between amber and blue with the pattern breaking into smaller sections. Calith's ears flattened briefly, shock, Marcus thought, then tilted forward again. Perfect recall of intermediate-level status signals, including micro-variations in pattern structure that we don't formally teach until advanced coordination training. She turned to address the broader group. Training pause, everyone to observation positions. I need to test this properly. The warriors moved to the facility's edges, and Marcus suddenly found himself the center of attention in ways that made him want to disappear. Calith took a formal ready position in the center of the training floor. Lieutenant Rivera, I'm going to execute a series of movements. Before each movement, I want you to tell me what my status plates indicate. Don't guess what action I'll take, just describe what you see in the plates. Yes, instructor. Calith's status plates shifted, amber to blue, pattern contracting tightly. Blue coloration contracted pattern, feels like defensive. Something about reducing profile or preparing for impact. Calith dropped into a defensive crouch, exactly what Marcus's interpretation had suggested. Her plates shifted again, green with expanding patterns, brighter than before. Green with expansion, aggressive intent, preparing to advance or strike. Calith exploded into an offensive lunge, her movement precise and devastating. Third shift, complex pattern, multiple colors cycling, sections breaking apart and reforming. Marcus hesitated. This one's more complicated. Multiple colors, fragmented pattern, coordination signal, like you're expecting the formation to split and regroup. Or maybe signaling for partners to take flanking positions while you engage center. Calith executed a complex maneuver that would have required coordinated partner support if this had been actual formation work rather than solo demonstration. Her movements showing exactly the kind of split-end flank approach Marcus had described. The observation area erupted in murmurs, Savari warriors speaking rapidly to each other in their language. Ears twitching in positions Marcus was learning meant surprise or interest or both. An older Savari male approached, his armor covered in what Marcus recognized as combat achievement markers. This was someone senior, someone important. Instructor Calith, what's the meaning of this demonstration? Master Instructor Torvan, Calith bowed with respect that suggested significant rank difference. The human officer, Lieutenant Rivera, has been training with us for 3 days. In that time, with no formal instruction in status plate language, he has begun naturally processing our combat signals. What you just witnessed was him accurately interpreting intermediate-level status patterns in real time. Torvan studied Marcus with the kind of assessment that made him feel like he was being evaluated at a molecular level. The older warrior's eyes were a darker amber than Calith's, and they held the kind of experienced judgment that came from decades of assessing warrior potential. 3 days, Torvan said, making it somehow both statement and question. Human, what's your background? Combat intelligence, signals analysis, xenosociology, master instructor. I study cross-species communication patterns and cultural integration. Combat is secondary specialization. Xenosociology, Torvan repeated, like the word explained everything or nothing. You study how different species communicate, and you applied those analytical frameworks to our status plates. I suppose, master instructor, though honestly I wasn't being that formal about it. I just noticed the patterns existed and started trying to figure out what they meant because I kept being in the wrong position during formations. The status plates changed before Instructor Calith gave verbal commands, so I thought maybe they contained the information I was missing. Something shifted in Torvan's expression, approval, maybe, or respect. You identified a gap in your performance, hypothesized an information source, and began unconsciously testing your hypothesis through observation and correlation. That's exactly how competent warriors develop situational awareness. He turned to Caliph. How many of our allied species officers have achieved this level of status plate comprehension without formal instruction? None, Master Instructor. Most require translation implants and months of dedicated training before they can process even basic signals. Lieutenant Rivera is the first I've encountered who's naturally pattern matching the language. Torven's ears tilted forward, maximum interest. Then we have something unprecedented. A human officer who can potentially coordinate with our forces using our primary communication methodology rather than relying on verbal translation as secondary backup. He moved closer to Marcus, and the younger warrior had to force himself not to step back from the intensity of that attention. Lieutenant Rivera, I want to understand how you're processing this information. Our status plate language evolved over thousands of years to be readable by Savari, but difficult for potential enemies to intercept or decode. It requires processing visual information in specific spectrums, tracking micro-movements across multiple body regions simultaneously, interpreting cultural context that's embedded in pattern variations. You should not be able to do this naturally, yet you clearly are. Explain. Marcus took a breath, tried to organize thoughts he'd been having unconsciously into something that made verbal sense. Master Instructor, I think it's pattern recognition. Humans evolved as persistence hunters and social primates. We're really good at reading patterns in complex systems. Weather patterns, animal behavior patterns, social hierarchy patterns. We look for correlations and test hypotheses almost automatically, even when we're not consciously aware we're doing it. He gestured at Caliph. Instructor Caliph's status plates aren't random. They follow consistent rules. Certain colors appear in certain contexts. Patterns expand or contract based on intended movement type. The timing of shifts correlates with action execution. Once I noticed those patterns existed, my brain just started cataloging them. Same way I can read human body language without consciously analyzing every microexpression. The details are different, but the underlying process is the same. Observation, pattern detection, hypothesis testing, refinement. In 3 days, Torvin said, you've gone from not knowing the status plates carried information to accurately reading intermediate-level signals. In 3 days. Is that unusually fast, Master Instructor? Several Savari laughed, and Torvin's ears tilted in what might have been amusement. Lieutenant, our warriors begin learning status plate language as children and require years to achieve the level of comprehension you've just demonstrated. Allied species officers with advanced translation technology and months of intensive training typically don't reach intermediate proficiency. So yes, 3 days is exceptionally fast. It suggests human perceptual processing is significantly more adaptable than we'd understood. He turned to address the broader group. Training pause is extended. I want documentation of Lieutenant Rivera's capabilities. Instructor Caliph, you'll work with him on formal testing protocols. Let's determine the scope of human pattern recognition abilities and what implications this has for interspecies combat coordination. To Marcus directly, Lieutenant, you've just become the most interesting officer in this training program. Whether that's fortunate or unfortunate remains to be seen, but it will certainly be informative. How do you feel about extended testing? Marcus processed the fact that his attempt to avoid looking incompetent had somehow turned him into a research subject. I'm willing to participate, Master Instructor, though I should note that I can't speak for all humans. What I'm doing might be individual capability rather than species typical. Noted. But even if you're an outlier that demonstrates potential that we didn't know humans possessed. That's valuable information for alliance coordination. Torven's expression grew more serious. Also, Lieutenant, regarding your earlier mortification about staring at Instructor Caliph's posterior armor plating, you were doing exactly what a good warrior should do. gathering tactical information from available sources. The fact that those sources are located on her lower back and hips is simply anatomy, not inappropriate attention. Clear. In my defense, I was very focused on the patterns and not thinking about optics. Clearly. Caleth's smile was genuine now, lacking any of the predatory edge Savari expressions sometimes carried. You know what this means, right? You've just changed the entire trajectory of the joint training program. If humans can naturally process our status plate language, if your pattern recognition is sophisticated enough to decode our primary communication without formal instruction, that makes your species far more valuable as combat partners than anyone anticipated. That seems like a lot of weight to put on one guy who got lucky with pattern matching, instructor. Perhaps, but lucky or not, you've demonstrated capability that opens new possibilities. Master Instructor Torvin doesn't impress easily, and you've impressed him. That matters. She paused, then added, also, you're absolutely going to be famous across the training programs as the human who learned to read us by staring at my butt. I'm going to make sure of it. Marcus groaned. Please don't. Too late. It's already becoming a story. Embrace your legacy, Lieutenant. My legacy is tactical observation being misinterpreted as inappropriate attention. Your legacy is demonstrating that humans possess adaptive perceptual abilities that make them ideal partners for Savari coordination. The part about your methods involving butt staring is just memorable detail that ensures the lesson sticks. She was enjoying this way too much. But Marcus couldn't help smiling despite his mortification because, somehow, his desperate attempt to figure out why he kept being in the wrong position had turned into a discovery that might actually strengthen the human-Savari alliance. All because he'd been staring at his instructor's armor plating, trying to decode tactical patterns, and she'd been secure enough to ask directly instead of assuming the worst. Sometimes the most important breakthroughs come from asking uncomfortable questions instead of making assumptions. And sometimes all it takes is one person paying attention to patterns and another person noticing they're paying attention and asking why instead of assuming they know. The coordination testing facility turned out to be less facility and more elaborate obstacle course designed by someone who thought regular obstacle courses weren't painful enough. Marcus stared at the three-dimensional arrangement of platforms, barriers, and moving targets that filled the massive chamber, and revised his earlier assessment of the Savari training program from challenging to potentially lethal. The goal, Caleth explained, standing beside him at the facility entrance, is to navigate the course while maintaining formation coordination with your partner. I'll be signaling transitions through status plates. You'll need to read those signals and adjust positioning accordingly while also managing environmental hazards. Instructor, I've only been reading status plates for one day. This seems like an advanced application. It is advanced. That's the point. Master Instructor Torvin wants to establish your baseline capabilities and your learning curve. We're documenting everything: neural activity, visual tracking, response times, accuracy rates. This isn't just training anymore. This is research that will inform how the Alliance structures future human-Savari coordination. Marcus looked at the monitoring equipment mounted around the facility, sensors that were probably tracking his every physiological response, cameras recording from multiple angles, analysis systems processing data in real time. No pressure at all. Understood, Instructor. What happens if I fail catastrophically and fall off one of those platforms? Safety fields will catch you, though falling will be noted in your evaluation, and I'll mock you relentlessly. That's very reassuring. I thought so. Caleth moved to the course entrance, her armor plates already beginning to shift colors as she prepared. Ready position, Lieutenant. We start in 30 seconds. Marcus took his position, tried to calm his breathing, and focused on Caleth's status plates. Amber, steady patterns, ready configuration. He was starting to recognize this as the neutral state, combat ready but not yet committed to specific action. The course activated, platforms beginning their programmed movements, targets appearing at random intervals. Calith's plates shifted blue with contracting patterns. Defensive anchor. She dropped into a low crouch on the first platform, and Marcus matched her positioning half a second behind. Not perfect timing, but adequate. Green expansion. Offensive advancement. Calith launched herself at a target, and Marcus followed, his strike hitting milliseconds after hers. They moved through the course, Calith signaling transitions through her status plates, Marcus reading and responding as fast as his human reflexes allowed. He was slower than a Savari partner would be. His nervous system simply couldn't process and execute as quickly as theirs. But he was anticipating correctly, reading the signals before they became actions. Amber cycling to blue to green, complex transition sequence. Formation split, flank approach, coordinated strike. Marcus went left as Calith went right, both of them targeting the same obstacle from different angles, their strikes landing within a second of each other. Adequate, Calith called out, and Marcus decided to interpret that as high praise given Savari standards. They continued for 40 minutes, running increasingly complex coordination sequences. Marcus fell twice, once when he misread a signal and moved too early, once when he read correctly but his human balance mechanics couldn't handle a platform transition that Savari physiology made effortless. Both times the safety fields caught him, and both times Calith made a sound that his translator rendered as amused disappointment. "You're going to mock me for the falling, aren't you?" Marcus asked during a water break. "Extensively and with great detail, but you're also exceeding baseline expectations, so the mockery will be affectionate rather than cruel." "I'm honored. You should be. I don't offer affectionate mockery to just anyone." Calith studied the monitoring displays that showed data from the course run. "Your accuracy on signal interpretation is running at about 78%. Your response time is slower than Savari to Savari coordination, but that's expected given human neurological processing speeds. What's remarkable is that your accuracy is improving in real time. You're learning from each mistake and adjusting your interpretations. That's just basic pattern refinement, instructor. See wrong interpretation, correct hypothesis, test new approach." "Yes, but you're doing it at speeds that suggest your pattern recognition isn't just conscious analysis. You're building intuitive comprehension, the same way our children learn. That's not typical for adult learning, especially not for cross-species communication systems." Master Instructor Torven entered the facility, accompanied by two other senior officers Marcus didn't recognize. All three were studying display screens that showed the data from the course run. 78% accuracy on intermediate signals with 1 day of exposure, Torven said, not quite making it a question. "Lieutenant Rivera, how are you processing the status plates? What's your internal experience when you read them?" Marcus tried to articulate something that happened mostly unconsciously. "Master Instructor, it's not really a conscious process. I watch Instructor Calith's plates and they shift and my brain just knows what they mean, or thinks it knows. Sometimes I'm wrong and then I adjust. But the actual interpretation happens too fast for me to break it down into steps." "Unconscious competence," one of the other senior officers said, a female warrior with gray coloring that suggested significant age. "He's moved past conscious analysis into intuitive processing. That should take months of exposure." "Should," Torven agreed. "But clearly doesn't, at least not for this human. The question is whether Lieutenant Rivera is a unique case or whether other humans share this capability." He turned to Marcus. "Lieutenant, how many other human officers are in the current training cohort?" 9, Master Instructor, though I should note that I was selected specifically for cross-cultural communication background. The others have different specializations, tactics, engineering, logistics. I can't guarantee they'll show the same pattern recognition abilities. Nevertheless, I want them tested. If even half of your cohort demonstrates similar capabilities, That's significant. Instructor Caliph, you'll coordinate with the other training supervisors to implement status plate comprehension assessments across all human officers. Yes, Master Instructor. Torvin studied Marcus for a long moment. Lieutenant, I'm reassigning you from standard training track to accelerated integration program. You'll continue working with Instructor Caliph, but your focus will shift from learning our basic protocols to exploring the limits of human-Savari coordination. You'll also be training other humans in status plate reading. If you can do it intuitively, perhaps you can teach others to do the same. Master Instructor, I'm honored, but I'm not sure I'm qualified to teach something I barely understand myself. You're more qualified than anyone else we have. You're the only human who's demonstrated this capability. That makes you the expert by default, whether you feel expert or not. Torven's expression suggested this was not up for debate. Report to Advanced Coordination Wing tomorrow. Instructor Caliph will remain your primary supervisor. The senior officers left, still discussing data and implications in tones Marcus couldn't quite hear. He turned to Caliph, who looked somewhere between excited and concerned. Instructor, what exactly is the Advanced Coordination Wing? It's where we train elite units for joint species operations. Very small program, highly selective, usually requires years of experience before acceptance. She paused. You've been here 4 days and you're being fast-tracked into a program that most Savari warriors spend decades trying to qualify for. How does that make you feel? Terrified, unqualified. Like someone made a clerical error and I'm going to be found out. Good. That means you're aware of the stakes. Overconfidence would be concerning. Caliph's ears tilted forward. That expression Marcus was learning to read as genuine interest rather than challenge. But Marcus, you should understand what this means beyond the personal advancement. If you succeed in this program, if you demonstrate that humans can coordinate with us at elite level, you'll change how the Alliance views human military potential. Your species has been treated as junior partners, useful but limited. This could shift that perception significantly. Marcus thought about 8 billion humans back on Earth, dozens of colonies scattered across space, an alliance that had spent 40 years trying to prove themselves worthy of being taken seriously by older civilizations. No pressure then. Considerable pressure, Caliph agreed cheerfully. But you seem capable of handling it. Otherwise, you wouldn't have started unconsciously learning our combat language by staring at my butt. Are you ever going to let me forget that? Absolutely not. It's too perfect a story. The human who revolutionized interspecies combat coordination by studying my posterior armor plating. That's going into every training brief I ever give. Marcus groaned, but he couldn't quite suppress his smile. You're enjoying this way too much, Instructor. I really am. It's rare that I get to be both impressed and amused simultaneously. She grew more serious. But Marcus, I mean it when I say you're changing things. The conversation Master Instructor Torven is having right now, that's about restructuring our entire approach to Alliance military coordination. Because of what you've demonstrated, that's significant. I just wanted to stop being in the wrong position during formations. And in trying to solve that problem, you've demonstrated capabilities that no one knew humans possessed. That's how breakthroughs happen. Someone trying to solve a practical problem stumbles onto something larger. She gestured toward the facility exit. Come on, I'm buying you a meal. You've earned it, and we need to discuss the Advanced Coordination Program before you walk into it tomorrow. They headed to the facility's dining area, a space where warriors from multiple training groups gathered between sessions. Marcus was hyper-aware of the looks he was getting, the way conversations paused as he passed, the mixture of curiosity and skepticism in various warriors' expressions. They're talking about you, Caliph said quietly. Word spreads fast in training communities. The human who can read status plates is already becoming a story that makes me sound either remarkably capable or remarkably lucky. Both, probably. But capability that looks like luck is still capability. Don't undersell what you've accomplished. She guided them to a quieter section, away from the main crowd. Now, advanced coordination. What do you know about joint species combat operations? General theory. Different species contribute different capabilities. Coordination requires translation protocols and extensive training in each other's communication systems. Success rates are lower than single-species operations because of integration friction. Correct. Now, what if we could eliminate most of that integration friction by having humans who can natively read our primary communication language in Savari, who can interpret human body language and verbal cues? What if coordination could happen at speeds approaching single-species units? Marcus saw where this was going. You'd have combined forces that leverage both species' strengths without the normal coordination penalties. Humans get Savari combat expertise and movement capabilities. Savari get human adaptability and pattern recognition. Exactly. That's what Advanced Coordination Wing develops, units that don't just cooperate across species boundaries but actually integrate at tactical level. It's experimental, difficult, and most attempts have failed because the communication barriers are too high. Caliph leaned forward. But if humans can learn our status plate language naturally, and if we can learn to project intent through methods humans can read, verbal emphasis, gesture, whatever works, then maybe we can build something unprecedented. An actual joint species combat unit that coordinates like a single species force. Yes, and you're going to help develop it because you've proven the concept is possible. She paused, then added, also because you're now the poster child for human Savari coordination, and Master Instructor Torvin wants to see how far this can go. Marcus absorbed this, processed the magnitude of what he was being asked to do, and decided that being thrown into the deep end was apparently his life now. Okay, what do I need to know before tomorrow? That the other warriors in advanced coordination are the best of the best. That they've trained for years to reach this level, that they'll be skeptical of a human who's been here less than a week being placed in their program. Caliph's expression was serious, and that you'll need to prove yourself continuously, because one successful demonstration isn't enough. You'll need to show sustained performance, consistent capability, genuine integration with the unit. And if I fail, then we document what didn't work and try different approaches. This is experimental, Marcus. Failure is data, but I don't think you're going to fail because you've already demonstrated the core capability. Now it's just a matter of refining and expanding. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, and Marcus reflected on how much his life had changed in 4 days. He'd gone from struggling trainee to research subject to advanced program candidate, all because he'd been desperate enough to stare at his instructor's armor plating looking for patterns. Instructor Caliph, yes, thank you, for not assuming the worst when you noticed I was watching your status plates, for asking directly instead of just reporting me for inappropriate conduct, for being willing to see capability instead of assuming misconduct. Caliph's ears tilted in a position Marcus was learning meant genuine appreciation. Marcus, in my culture, direct questions are valued over assumptions. You were looking at me with intensity that could have been inappropriate, but you were also clearly focused on something specific. Asking what you were doing seemed more useful than assuming I knew. She paused. Also, I'm secure enough in my own combat capability that I don't need to assume every male who looks at me is doing so for sexual reasons. Sometimes people are just trying to learn tactical communication. By staring at your butt, by observing my status plates which happen to be located on my posterior armor plating, the terminology matters. Does it though? Because the human who learned to read us by staring at your butt seems to be the version that's spreading. Yes, well, accurate terminology is less memorable than scandalous phrasing. People remember the story about inappropriate staring that turned out to be tactical genius. They might not remember the technical details about status plate interpretation and pattern recognition. Caliph grinned, that tooth-heavy expression that Marcus was learning to find friendly rather than threatening. Embrace it. You're going to be famous. Might as well be famous for something memorable. Marcus shook his head, but he was smiling. My parents are going to love this. Yes, our son is revolutionizing interspecies military coordination. Yes, it started with him staring at his instructor's butt. We're very proud. As they should be. Tactical observation skills deserve recognition, regardless of what anatomical region they're directed at. 6 months later, Lieutenant Marcus Rivera stood in a combat simulation with a mixed unit of 4 humans and 6 Savari, executing coordination that the observers were calling unprecedented tactical integration. The simulation was running a scenario that would have been challenging for a single-species unit: urban combat environment, hostile forces using guerrilla tactics, civilians present requiring protection. For a mixed-species unit, it should have been nearly impossible given the normal coordination friction. But Marcus's unit moved like a single organism. Humans reading Savari status plates while Savari interpreted human verbal cues and body language, all of them flowing through the scenario, with the kind of synchronization that required each member to understand not just their own role, but everyone else's intentions. Civilians North Corridor, Lieutenant Sarah Chen called out, and before she finished speaking, 2 Savari warriors were already repositioning to provide cover, because they'd read her body language and vocal stress indicating urgent concern. Savari warrior, Dreven's status plates flashed green to blue, rapid cycling. Incoming threat, coordinated response required. Marcus and the other humans moved to flanking positions without needing verbal instruction. They cleared the scenario in 18 minutes, with 0 civilian casualties and minimal damage to friendlies. The simulation AI, designed to challenge elite units, had been systematically dismantled by warriors who could coordinate across species boundaries as fluently as single-species forces. The observation room erupted in discussion. Marcus could see senior officers from multiple alliance species watching the displays, their expressions ranging from impressed to stunned. Master Instructor Torven entered the simulation chamber, accompanied by Alliance military brass that Marcus recognized from briefing materials, but had never met in person. Lieutenant Rivera, Torven said formally, Admiral Kestran of the Alliance Joint Military Command wishes to speak with your unit. The Admiral was Velani, a species whose crystalline bodies refracted light in ways that made them look like mobile rainbows. Their voice came through translation systems with harmonics that suggested they were genuinely impressed. Lieutenant Rivera, I've been reviewing your unit's performance over the past 6 months. The coordination you've achieved is consistently outperforming single-species units with more experience and training. I need to understand how you've accomplished this. Marcus glanced at his team, 4 humans who'd spent 6 months learning to read Savari status plates, 6 Savari who'd learned to interpret human communication patterns. They'd become something unprecedented. An actual joint species combat unit that coordinated like they'd trained together for years rather than months. Admiral, it started with pattern recognition, Marcus said. Humans are good at identifying patterns in complex systems. Once we understood that Savari status plates carried tactical information, learning to read them became a matter of observation and hypothesis testing. And once the Savari understood that humans broadcast intent through vocal stress, microexpressions, and body language, they could learn to read us the same way. But other species have attempted similar integration without achieving these results, Admiral Kestran observed. What makes human Savari coordination uniquely effective? Warrior Dreven spoke up, his status plates shifting to the amber steady that meant he was offering formal input. Admiral, humans process visual patterns with speed and accuracy that we didn't expect. They can track status plate changes across multiple warriors simultaneously, building real-time tactical awareness that approaches our own capabilities. Combined with Savari movement and combat expertise, the result is a force that leverages both species' strengths without the normal coordination delays. Lieutenant Chen added, and Savari communication is actually well suited to human perception. We evolved to read complex social cues, and status plates are just another layer of social information. Once we understood what we were looking at, learning to interpret it came naturally. Admiral Kestran studied the unit for a long moment. I'm authorizing expansion of the joint training program. What you've developed here, this level of integration, needs to be replicated across Alliance forces. Lieutenant Rivera, you'll be reassigned to Training Command. Your job will be teaching other humans how to read Savari status plates and training Savari warriors in human communication interpretation. Marcus blinked, processing the fact that his assignment had just shifted from combat training to becoming the architect of an entire integration program. Admiral, with respect, I'm not sure I'm qualified. You've demonstrated proof of concept, Lieutenant. You've built a unit that coordinates at levels we thought impossible for mixed-species forces. That makes you uniquely qualified to teach others how to do the same. The Admiral's tone suggested this wasn't up for debate. Master Instructor Torven will remain as senior advisor. Instructor Kaleth will serve as your primary Savari counterpart. Together, you'll develop curriculum for what we're calling the Integration Core. After the Admiral left and the formal briefings concluded, Marcus found himself alone with Kaleth in the training facility's observation room, both of them processing what had just happened. You know what this means, right? Kaleth said. Your story, the human who learned to read us by staring at my butt, that's going to be told in every training facility across Alliance space. You're not just famous, you're legendary. Marcus groaned. Can we please find a different way to phrase it? No, because the story is perfect. It's memorable, it's funny, and it demonstrates important principles about not making assumptions and asking direct questions instead of jumping to conclusions. Kaleth's ears tilted forward in genuine amusement. Besides, it's true. They stood together watching the simulation playback, seeing the unit move with coordination that 6 months ago would have seemed impossible. Humans and Savari flowing together, each supporting the other, creating something stronger than either species could have achieved alone. We really did it, Marcus said quietly. We built an actual integrated unit. You did it, Kaleth corrected. You saw a pattern no one else was paying attention to, and you figured out how to read it. Everything else followed from that initial observation. The observation that started with me staring at your butt, trying to figure out why I kept being in the wrong position. Yes, and now that observation is going to reshape how the Alliance thinks about joint species military operations. Not bad for someone who was just trying to avoid looking incompetent. Marcus laughed, the sound carrying relief and exhaustion and pride all tangled together. You know, when I got selected for this program, I thought it would be a good career move. I didn't think I'd accidentally become the poster child for human-alien integration. Life is full of surprises, most of them less pleasant than you revolutionized military coordination by being observant. Kaleth's expression softened. Marcus, seriously, what you've accomplished matters. You've changed how humans are viewed in Alliance military structures. You've demonstrated capabilities that no one knew your species possessed. And you've built something, this unit, this program, that's going to outlast both of us. We built it. You were the one who was willing to teach instead of dismiss, who asked questions instead of assuming, who saw potential instead of just seeing a struggling trainee. True, I'll accept partial credit. She paused, then added, though I'm going to make sure everyone knows the story starts with you staring at my butt. That part is non-negotiable. I wouldn't expect anything less. Years later, when the Alliance Integration Corps had become standard military training and joint species units were operating across Alliance space, with coordination that had once seemed impossible. Historians would trace it all back to joint training programs and diplomatic initiatives and institutional decisions. But the people who were actually there knew it started with a mortified human lieutenant staring at his instructor's armor plating, trying to figure out what he was missing, and a Savari warrior secure enough to ask, "Why are you looking at my butt?" instead of assuming she knew the answer. Sometimes the most profound changes start with someone being brave enough to admit they don't understand, and someone else being kind enough to explain instead of judge. Sometimes all it takes is one person watching patterns and another person noticing they're watching and asking what they see instead of assuming they know. And sometimes the most important breakthroughs come from someone trying to solve a practical problem, like why they keep being in the wrong position during formations, and stumbling onto something that changes everything. The Integration Corps Training Manual, when it was finally published, included a section titled Observational Learning and Cross-Species Pattern Recognition. The official version was dignified, professional, full of pedagogical theory and training protocols. But every instructor who taught from it knew the unofficial version, the one they told trainees when explaining the program's origins. This all started because a human officer was staring at instructor Caliph but trying to figure out why he kept screwing up formations, and she was secure enough to ask him what he was looking at instead of just assuming he was being inappropriate. He was reading her status plates, tactical information displayed on posterior armor plating, and learning our combat language without knowing that's what he was doing. Turned out humans are really good at pattern recognition, and our status plates are really readable if you know to look for patterns. Everything else followed from that. So the lesson is, ask direct questions instead of making assumptions. Pay attention to patterns even in unexpected places, and don't be too embarrassed about your learning methods to figure out what actually works. Oh, and always look where the information is, regardless of whether that's someone's face, their hands, or their butt. Tactical data doesn't care about human comfort zones. Marcus Rivera, eventually made admiral, became head of Alliance Integration Corps Command, spent decades training mixed-species units that coordinated with the kind of fluidity that had once been considered impossible. And every single time he gave a speech, every time he presented awards, every time he did anything official, someone would inevitably bring up the story of how it all started. Admiral Rivera, is it true that you learned to read Savari status plates by staring at instructor Caliph's posterior? And every single time Marcus would sigh and say, "Yes. I was observing her armor plating, which displayed tactical information. I needed to improve my formation positioning." The fact that the armor plating was located on her lower back and hips is simply anatomy. And Caliph, who eventually made master instructor and became co-head of the Integration Corps training program, would inevitably add, "He was absolutely staring at my butt. But he was staring for good tactical reasons, so I'll allow it." They became legends together, the human who learned through observation and the Savari who asked direct questions. The partnership that proved integration was possible. The team that built something that changed how species worked together across the alliance. All because one person was willing to admit they were struggling, and another person was willing to help instead of judge. And all because sometimes the most important information is located in unexpected places, and the key to learning is being willing to look wherever the patterns lead you, even when it's embarrassing, even when it's someone's butt. Especially when it's someone's butt that happens to display critical tactical information that revolutionizes interspecies military coordination. Context matters, patterns matter, and sometimes the best thing you can do is ask direct questions instead of making assumptions. That's the real lesson. The butt staring is just memorable framing.